Before I begin, I just wanted to mention that I've got a lot of materials to show you, and so I apologize if we're going through it a little fast. But I've spent basically the last year off and on studying winter quarters as an original settlement, and also Florence and how it was platted over the top of winter quarters. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll be going into some detail about the settlement here, but my main focus, and which I will unveil at the end, is actually how the plat of winter quarters matches with the plat of Florence or present-day Omaha. There's not time to talk about the other settlements that the Saints had while they were here on the Nebraska side of the river. Cold Springs Camp, Cutler's Park, semi-permanent settlement that they made west of here. But as far as the winter quarters site, we know that members of the Quorum of the 12 came here on September 18th, 1846, and agreed that this was the spot for them to settle for the winter. A day later, they started laying out lots and streets, and on the 23rd of September 1846 is really when winter quarters got started, when people started moving here from Cutler's Park, about 1.5 miles, 2 miles west of here. According to the Douglas County history, winter quarters was the first white settlement within the current limits of Douglas County. Some believe that Cutler's Park was the first settlement, so won't go into that, but it was known by different references before it was known as winter quarters. Willard Richards, who in his journal called it winter rest, then council plain, and then finally winter quarters. The settlement itself was located between two brooks, or two creeks. As Hosea Stout in his journal mentioned, it was bounded on each end by two brooks of good running water. And this shows the two brooks, older map here, and then a newer USGS map shows Spring Creek and Mills Creek, or sometimes called Turkey Creek. So Mills Creek was on the north. It still exists. This is a photograph of close to where it actually is piped under Florence down to the Missouri River. On the south brook, Spring Creek, runs along the south edge of Forest Lawn Cemetery. And it's an intermittent creek. You can walk down through the cemetery and find parts of it. And so that was on the south side of what was winter quarters. As far as the layout's concerned, this is really fascinating to me. Was on a plain of the Missouri River, about 50 feet above the water level. The settlement itself and the streets were laid out roughly parallel to the river, but more parallel to the actual ridge lines here in this part of Florence. So the ridgeline alignment plays into how they laid out the city. It's about 22 degrees west of due north. And if you go up to the cemetery itself, you'll see the grave markers are laid out east to west. But the plaza where the monument is up there is actually laid out based on the property lines in the streets, which is based on the layout of winter quarters. So that's why the graves here seem to be off-centered from the monument, is because the grave markers are based on the north, south, east, west, whereas the plaza, the cemetery, and so forth is squared up with the actual layout of the original winter quarters. This is what it looks like today. So on the left, you can see how Florence, the declination of about 22 degrees off north. And then on the right, you can see that declination in the blue arrows. And then the red arrow shows the alignment of the rest of Omaha, which is basically the regular cardinal directions. So as you travel from those two areas back and forth, you'll notice a subtle change in the roads and how they turn and so forth. This is the original layout. It was done by Thomas Bullock in 1846. It shows the blocks, the streets, and also the names of the streets. To the right is the declination. So when you see these maps, you kind of just pretend it's one direction or the other, but the one on the right would be more attuned to the north, south, east, west. But the actual plat itself was drawn as if it was due north. These are the names of the streets. The streets were all, winter quarters were named after prominent pioneers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of what might be done to maybe help promote that and use that as an historical significance. The dash line, the street names below the dash line are street names that were never actually built. So the ones on the upper part were actually platted and built. The ones on the bottom were platted but never built. So there was a 5-acre block pattern that was used. It was part of the City of Zion plat that was revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith in 1833 as to how to design cities in the last days and during the millennium and so forth. In the winter quarters version versus Nauvoo, the winter quarters version were 5-acre block pattern, 20 lots to a block, 60-foot streets except for First Main and Second Main. First Main would have been this north-south street here. Second Main, the second north-south street to the left there, to the west. The community was divided into wards or ecclesiastical units, and there's evidence that even though it wasn't platted, there was an area north of the creek. There was some settlement as well. Why did they not fully develop the entire platted plat? Is because of concerns about security and attack. Brigham Young exhorted on October 18th, 1846, that they begin at the north end and then start to the south. So the actual built part of winter quarters does not include the entire plat, as shown here, but was cut off on the lots south of Joseph Street. And we'll talk a little bit more about those streets here later. Later, there was also a picket fence, and cabins were built as a picket wall in order to protect the settlement from attack. There were dwellings there, cabins, dugouts. Gopher Hill was identified as an area where there was many dugouts built at the base of Cahoon Street. Over 500 cabins were built. Other sources say up to maybe 700 cabins were built, sod houses as well. This describes the cabins. They were built with sod roofs, sod chimneys, dirt floors, curtains for bedrooms. Most of the cabins had 4 panes of glass, and probably one-room cabins for the most part. There's some described that had multiple rooms, mostly one-room cabins. In December of 1846, there was a report presented to the 12 that talked about what was happening in winter quarters. So this is September, October, November, December, so 4 months after the settlement was made. 3,400 inhabitants, 75 widows, 386 were ill, which is an interesting figure. Works out to be about 11%. Some other people who came here estimated as high as a third of the population was ill at that time. So that's an interesting statistic. And then others there. The 53 women at the bottom is interesting because many of the families of the Mormon battalion came here to winter quarters. There was an actual bishop who took care of their needs here in winter quarters. There's 3 buildings that are shown on the mural upstairs in the trail center that were very key to the settlement. Brigham Young's home, Willard Richards' Octagon House, and the council house. So we're all located close together on the north edge of the settlement. Brigham Young's home was east of the original mill site. It was a 1.5-story log home located west of the Octagon House. And where those actual buildings were is kind of a mystery of sorts, but we know it was east of the mill site, and I'll show you some other maps that will further indicate that. Willard Richards' Octagon House, some good, lighthearted, good-natured folks kind of made fun of his different house. They called it the potato heap, apple heap, coal pit, roundhouse, doctor's den, the tabernacle, the windmill. But we do know it was used as a post office, as a makeshift hospital. And it was his office. The little extension on the east side of it was used as his doctor's office. And 35 feet in diameter. So if you do the math on that, it was about 900 square feet. So a cabin versus the Octagon House, it was quite the structure for that time. And the thing that's unbelievable to me, they knew they were only going to be here 2 years, and yet they laid out a city based on the City of Zion plat as if they were going to stay much, much longer. The council house itself was for the Council of the 12 Apostles, as well as the Civic High Council that also was in play because of the need to have a government here in winter quarters. We think from Gail Holmes' research that the council house was about where the present fire station is, there on Dick Collins Road, on the frontage road of the freeway, down at 30th Street and I-680. So the council house was another location for civic activities, dances, meetings, and so forth. Many of the journals here in winter quarters talk about the stand. And apparently the stand was located next to the council house when there was pronouncements to be made to the citizens, to the saints. Oftentimes the church leaders would use that stand. It was also used in Cutler's Park and previously to this location. There was also a public square, which was located further south, where they thought the center of the development or the settlement would be. Of course, that ended up being on the south end because they didn't develop the entire plat at that time. And they had the Nauvoo bell there where they would call the saints to gather, and that's where they would hear sermons and admonitions and such. So that was the public meeting place. The map on the right shows the Florence plat. That location is now Florence Park. So as you drive by there, you can kind of visualize people standing there and crowding around and it being used as a town square at that location. As I mentioned, the town was started on the north end. It was very compact with what they called Kimball's Row, where he had a series of cabins built with his personal cabin on one end, and it was anchored on the other end by Newell K. Whitney's Bishop's Storehouse. And around that in the mill itself, which Linda here will speak about here in a few minutes, the Bishop's Storehouse and other businesses, even outside businesses, were started here. So this was really what I call the town center, if there was such for that period of time, was located on the north end, just east of where the mill was located. To understand what happened to winter quarters, you have to kind of understand Brigham Young's timeline. So he was a very busy man in 1847. So January is when he received section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the word and will of the Lord, where the Lord told him how to organize the wagon trains and how to go west. The Vanguard Company left winter quarters in April of 1847 from this location. Of course, the Salt Lake Valley, the place that they were going to, was reached in July. Brigham is back here in winter quarters in the fall of 1847 at the end of October. In Canesville, in December, he's sustained as the first or the second president and prophet of the church. And then the next spring, he also goes west again for the last time. Here's the wagons that went west from winter quarters during 1847 and 48. You notice it says Elkhorn there on the second line. I don't know if you can see that from back there. Elkhorn River was a rendezvous place. They did organize wagon trains here in winter quarters, but many of them went on their own to gather at Elkhorn River and then went west from there. So that's why it shows winter quarters and Elkhorn River. By July of 1848, winter quarters was abandoned. It was only a 2-year stint there for approval from the federal government. And Brigham it's documented on November 14th, 1847, that he mentioned about them going west and going back across the river for those who weren't ready to go west. So the last wagons left here on July 3rd, 1848, which started the rotting of sorts of the community. Here, an entire settlement was abandoned after being settled for a 2-year period. In 1850, there was a fire. Men came up the Missouri River, crossed the Missouri with a ferry here at winter quarters, which was often done. They would either come up the east side of the river and cross at the ferry, or they'd cross at the ferry down near Omaha and take the Omaha Trail to the Mormon Trail. So in April 1850, there was men who came up, ferried across, they camped, and all of a sudden they see the whole sky light up with flames and embers of a fire that destroyed winter quarters. So it was kind of like a baptism of fire of sorts, if you want to look at it that way. And of course, in 1854, Nebraska becomes a territory. The 20-year treaty with the Indians that was made in 1834 expired. And so many people came in at the same time to settle these areas. Omaha and Florence were settled about the same time. And James Cumley Mitchell, he was a friend of Peter Sarpy. Peter Sarpy apparently told him about the old Mormon town, and so he had a great interest in coming here. He eventually, in 1854, laid out the plat of Florence over the top of what was left of winter quarters. He also had great plans. There's not time to talk about it here. He had great plans for the territorial capital to be here, and also for the railroad to come through here, as that was a big issue back in that time as to where the railroad would actually go west. So it was platted in 1854 by James Cumley Mitchell. The territorial capital actually was moved here temporarily for several days and then moved back to Omaha. And so that kind of hope kind of evaporated. Also the hope of having the railroad also kind of flitted away. How did he get its name? At first they looked at calling it Rock Bottom because the river here, the Missouri River, has a rock bottom. Of course, that name has different iterations and meanings. And so I think they gave way to the idea of naming it Florence, which was after Florence Kilbourne, shown here. This was Mrs. Mitchell's grandchild from a previous marriage. And it's interesting to note, in 1855, a year after it was platted, Florence actually had more people here than there were in Omaha. Now, of course, that quickly changed, the rivalry between the two cities and the railroad and so forth, the territorial capital. But you can see the number of residents in Douglas County, and there were actually more people here in Florence than in Omaha. One of the things the Winter Quarters Company did, which was organized to promote the area, promote the city. James Cumley Mitchell was the secretary to that organization. It was later called the Florence Land Company. But they did an inventory, what was left. And I threw this in here because, okay, the town was vacated, abandoned, it burned down for the most part. What was left, and they did an inventory that's quite interesting. These are the things they found. So whether these tools were hiding in the grasses or where they were, it's kind of interesting to see the kinds of things that they actually found before building the town. And I looked up gimlets. Anybody know what gimlets are? I had to look it up. Gimlets are like an awl, but it has a screw on it, so you could actually make holes in leather and wood from that. So interesting look-see into the 1840s and what kind of tools were important back in pioneer times. This is a series of photographs I took in the Florence Bank. They're undated. think these are probably in the 1850s, maybe the 1860s. This shows Main Street, as it was called at the time, in Florence, now 30th Street in Omaha, looking north from State Street, which would be the street out here beside the Trail Center. Another view, probably about the same time. So Florence kind of lost out on the railroad and the territorial capital, but by default, in some respects, it became the major outfitting location going west on the Nebraska side of the river. And these show the wagon trains that left between 1854 and 1863 from this location. And the area down by the mill, next to the cemetery, the area by the mill is probably the most historic place here in winter quarters or Florence, just because of the activity and the staging and outfitting that took place. So if you had ancestors that came through here during that period of time, it's likely they were down there by the mill outfitting. And not only wagon trains, but all the handcart, all 10 of the handcart companies between 1856 and 1860 either came through winter quarters or were started here. So the first 7 in 1856 starting in 1856, started from Iowa City, where the railroad was extended at that time. But they all came through here. They crossed the ferry close by to Mormon Bridge, and they came to that area around the mill to re-outfit. Even the Martin and Willie Handcart companies, they did not get here until August of 1856, which played into their subsequent problems as they went west and met the early snows in Wyoming. But they were down there by the mill as well. So if you have handcart pioneers, that place down there, in my mind, is a pretty sacred place because of what happened there. Of course, later on, we had the down and back wagon trains that were from 1861 to 1868. The Saints bought properties here and were using warehouses to provide provisions. Wagon trains came from the Salt Lake Valley east with items that were more expensive, mostly flour, that they would trade or sell here and purchase other items that they needed to go west. They would actually pick up passengers. They would camp outside of Florence, probably down by Cutler's Park. When they were ready to pick up passengers, they would come into Florence and they would weigh their baggage, and then they would take them out to similar locations and teach the Saints, many of whom did not know how to cook or didn't know anything about frontier life. So a lot of people came through here with hopes and dreams of going west, and Florence is where that started for many of them. So I'm going to go through quickly, as my time is going fast here. I'm going to show you some maps and atlases of Florence and how it's changed over the years. This is the 1879-89 atlas. You see the river, you can see the declination of the Platte. This is a 1920 atlas. I might mention that in 1917, the city of Omaha actually annexed Florence. So many still don't know that Florence is not a separate community. It was actually annexed by Omaha. And that plays into the layout, like I said, and actual street names as well. This is an interesting photograph of the Missouri River in 1921. Again, Florence in 1923, you can see they did finally get a railroad, but not across the Missouri River. It came up from the south, apparently. So here's the unveiling. Florence was platted over the top of what was left of winter quarters. So what did that actually look like? Here's the plat of winter quarters, as I mentioned, with the different streets, knowing that not all of it was actually built, but the upper half was. Here's Florence in 1856, what it looked like. We think 1856. And here is, instead of showing you a plat of Florence over the top of winter quarters, it was easier to show winter quarters platted over the top of Florence, and this is what it looks like. So I've spent months trying to figure this out. It's just a real puzzle to try to match it up. And here it is in more detail. So you can kind of orient yourself. The blue spot there, MTC, that's the trail center, so it can orient you there with State Street, going up and down the hill there. See it right there. Cemetery is marked C, Temple is marked T. P is the Florence Park. And the thing that's interesting, basically what they did, to make a long story short, they took the plat of Florence and just re-subdivided the blocks that were already there. So you have basically a plat that is finer block pattern than what the Saints actually made. In fact, if you look at the green line going up and down, it went through the center of the original 5-acre blocks that the Saints made as part of winter quarters. So split those up. This is the streets that I showed you before. This is the diorama upstairs that shows the layout. So you have first main, second main. Second main on the north end was where the little town center was, where Brigham's home was, the council office, the Octagon home, and many businesses that were used there. So if you add on to this, the Omaha streets, you can see the current street names. So as you drive around winter quarters and you see these signs, I'll tell you a little bit about how that was changed. And it was changed multiple times. This was really a puzzle because the street names changed after winter quarters when Florence was platted, and then the street names changed again when it became Omaha. In fact, you can see 30th Street now goes down the middle of the center blocks of winter quarters. So as you drive up and down 30th Street, I want you to think about this every time you do this, okay? Every time you drive up and down 30th Street, you're going through the middle center block configuration of winter quarters. And they basically created smaller blocks and a new main street for the town of Florence in doing that. Okay, if you walk around Florence and look at the street signs, which probably only city planners do, I don't know if anybody else does that, but they have some historic signs still on some of the intersections, which I would love to see resurrected and reused. But this is one of them. Tucker Street is now Omaha. Jefferson Street was what it was called when it was Florence. And here is this was an enigma to try to match up all the street names. The red names on the left were the actual platted and built parts of winter quarters. The blue names on the left were the streets that were platted but never built. First main and second main at the bottom there, those, as I mentioned, were streets in winter quarters. And if you look at the Florence plat in 1856 and then Omaha present, you can see how the names have changed. The green lettered names, I don't know if you can see that very well from the back. The green names are all presidents' names. And if somebody wants another research project, why did they change all the presidents' names when Omaha changed the street names to different names? That's kind of a curious thing to me. So that's my research. To wrap it up, this is kind of how those items, that some of the ones I talked about, lay out over the Florence plat. Number 1 is the cemetery. Number 2 is the Florence Park. 3 is 30th Street cutting up through. You can see how they broke up the patterns of the blocks. You look to the west of 30th Street, you can see the original layouts of the winter quarters lots. 5 is now a park, and we think that was close by where the businesses and such were at winter quarters. 6 is the mill site. 7 is where the mill was moved to. And I'm sure Linda will talk a little bit more about that, and so forth. So that's the end of my presentation. If there's time at the end, I have a couple other slides and a short video that shows what winter quarters or Florence looked like in 1954. So that's it, folks.